A Shalom Akim, Shabbat Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Makabradash, should have honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone, teachings of truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquath who may listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. For today's lesson, I kind of just wanted to go through, I guess this idea of restraint, and sometimes, through examination and so on and so forth, going through certain situations, sometimes you'd realize that the Lord puts us in situations to basically exercise restraint. And when I say restraint, I mean basically it kind of like a chains, and think of it as chains, not actual chains, but maybe like basically like chains, like how chains hold down a prisoner, you know to prevent them from doing certain things, right? And ultimately, that's basically the spirit, being able to govern, our actions in certain situations, because sometimes the easy thing to do is really to get carnal sometimes. And then I promise you, because I'm in the flesh as well, right? I feel it. There are times when it would feel really good just to get very carnal, but sometimes that's not always the best solution, right? Sometimes it's you have to kind of like fall back. You have to kind of like take the low, so to speak. Sometimes it's it might be a lot more detrimental. And honestly, you know what, sometimes when you really think about it too, a lot of times, that's what Satan wants, is to get you out of that zone, because then you start having some of these thoughts, right? And then it'll feel so good to get out, into the carnal and out of the spiritual, right? So, you know, I just wanted to get like maybe like, a couple of maybe like one or two examples of this, you know, of what I'm kind of referring to. And, Lord's will, this lesson, would be edifying, right? And it says, I'm just going to get something that Paul said. This is Galatians 5, verse 16 here. And it says, "And I say then, walk in the spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. But if ye be led of the Spirit, ye are not under the law. But the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such are like, of which I tell you before, as I have also told you in time past, that they which do these things shall not inherit the kingdom of the Most High." Right? So these things, you know, these are things that are basically of the flesh, right? And as much as a lot of the times it'll feel good, knowing in that situation it may not, it's not always the best route, so because so sometimes you have to like basically like bridle yourself. You might have certain thoughts, what I'm saying, and ultimately it's like, okay, you gotta rebuke that, and then continue to basically stay in the spirit, because that's what Satan is. It's like he's going about as a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour, right? So what I'm saying, so it's to preserve yourself, especially in this time where things are like intensified, when you deal with people like in a worldly sense and so on and so forth. For them, they don't have any thought to actually try and restrain themselves. There's no conscience. There's no spirit to be able to like, pull them back from certain actions and like redivert their understanding to doing something else, right? Or maybe like, for example, taking the low. This is a society that it's basically, get your lick back, so to speak, right? So, I wanted to get an example of this actually. This was, something recently I'd experienced. Actually, matter of fact, let me get this in Ephesians actually, because I thought this would probably be appropriate. Then I'll get an example here. This is Ephesians 4, verse 26, and it says, "Be angry and sin not, and let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give a place to the devil," right? So, you know, a lot of the times, a good mass majority of the times, we are angry, we are vexed, we are annoyed. As the scriptures say that it was Lot, he was vexed with the filthy conversations of the wicked. I promise you, it's not. I know it's not easy, because you're around people, hearing their abominable conversations, you're hearing their filthy manners of life, and you don't want to be around them. You kind of just want to be alone. As Jeremiah said, he said, how he sat alone, and he was filled with that basically that indignation of the Lord, right? Now that righteous anger, right? So it's, and that's a lot of the times why, some of the reasons we're angry, like, okay, but at the same time, we strive, I should say, to not sin, right? And that this world has a problem in thinking that it's always nice, it's always good to be smiling all the time. And the scriptures say that, some basically, when a person has a lot of wisdom, they scarcely smile, to roughly paraphrase, right? So it changes your countenance. So a lot of the times, yes, we are angry, but remember the restraint. Remember to just, if you can, just to depart by yourself, take a walk, or basically try, I don't know, try to get away from these people, man. you know it's gonna be, it's gonna basically mentally, it's gonna mentally recharge you, because a lot of times you just have to get away from these people and sit alone, right? You can't be around these people all the time, because a lot of the things that they do, it'll irritate you, right? So sometimes it's healthy for you, just to depart by yourself, right? I wanted to get an example of this. This is one of the examples that really stuck out of my mind when I was thinking about this topic. I want to get it in the amplified. Give me 1 second. This is an example of restraint, and it says, this is this is 1 Samuel chapter 24. I'll start at verse 1 and read down, right? Because in this time of like David's life, he's being sought after by Saul, right? And I want to show you an example of his restraint, right? It says here, when Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 men, chosen out of all Israel, and went to search for David and his men in front of the rocks of wild goats. And on the way he came to the sheepfolds, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. And it says, and now David and his men were sitting in the caves, cave's innermost recesses, David's men said unto him, Behold, this day of which the Lord said unto you, Behold, I will hand over my enemy to you, and you shall do to him as it seemed good to you. Then David arose in the darkness and stealthily cut off the hem edge of Saul's robe. Afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off a hem of Saul's robe, right? And I think in the KJV it says, it was a piece of his garment, so to speak, that David was wearing. I'm sorry, that Saul was wearing. And it says here, I'll read verse 5 again. And afterward, David's conscience. Let's so his okay. Conscience, I think that means con is with, and then you have science, which is knowledge, right? So, the spirit, kind of basically like intervene, and it's like, okay, let me, this is not right. Let me not put hands on him. It says conscience. It says the faculty of knowing what is right, right? It says the awareness that acts, I'm reading in the etymology, of which one's responsible do or do not conform to the one's ideal right, sense of fairness or justice or moral sense, innermost thoughts, desires, intentions, feelings, from the Latin conscientia, meaning a joint knowledge of something, right? So knowledge, so David had the wisdom. Well, he had a fear of the Lord, because that's really, what produces wisdom, is really that fear of the Lord. So it's like, okay, let me continue reading and you'll see. So it's this all kind of pieces together of David's basically his restraint, because remember, these are we're in a spiritual war, right? So sometimes in order to help preserve your peace of mind, sometimes you have to depart, and sit alone somewhere or recharge or whatever, right? So it says here, this is verse 6 in 1 Samuel 24, and it says, And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to put my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. So David, because at this time, Saul is still king. Like, he's like, he's the guy, right? He hasn't, when you go through this, you'll see what happens to him later on, and eventually David becomes king. But at this time, Saul is still king. So when you think about it, if let's just say, David actually, deleted him, so to speak, right? It looks bad that that he did that, right? It doesn't look very good that, okay, you got basically he got his own vengeance, right? Because, and some people might think, okay, it probably would have been justified if he did get his own vengeance, because, Saul threw javelins at him, right? So Saul was, you see the difference between, one man is being very spiritual and the other one's being very carnal, right? So it says here, verse 7, since he is the Lord's anointed. Then David strongly rebuked his men after these words, and did not let them rise up against Saul. Saul got up, left the cave, and went on his way. Then David also got up afterwards and went out of the cave, and called after Saul, saying, Lord, my king. And when Saul looked at him, David bowed his face to the ground and laid himself face down. And David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of the men who you say? David seeks to harm you. Behold, your eyes have seen today how the Lord had given you into my hand into the cave, and some told me to kill you, but I spared you. Then I said, I will not reach out against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Right? So, David, he was being very merciful, right? So he was just he didn't basically put his hands upon the Lord's anointed, right? He didn't exemplify that. He didn't try to get carnal, so to speak, right? So, and that's this. I'm just reading this as an example of that restraint. He didn't put his hands on him. He didn't drive his sword into his chest or something like that. He still acknowledged him. He still remained basically peaceable, right? Because when you think about the culture that we come out from, Babylonian, black culture, Hispanic culture, whatever, all these, it's basically Edomite culture, but Jake has taken it and used it to, they think that is so-called the right moral compass to do, right? They think those ways are always the right things to do, where they actually, our people disregard the importance of remaining spiritual, in the situations that they're in, right? So, what I'm saying? So there's no buffer to intervene for them. There is no bridle to pull them back, to remind them of certain situations. Kind of like, for example, slightly off topic, but you remember when you go through Joseph's story, when the Pharaoh's wife made her sexual advances towards him, he basically, Joseph, he understood, like, okay, these advances are not good advances, right? Because this is a married woman, right? Which shows you, even, this is an example that shows you that back then the law was oral, right? They didn't receive the law, the law, statutes, and commandments yet. This is before Moses' time, right? But the point is that he understood that, okay, this would be displeasing towards my power. I don't want to offend him, so I'm like, all right, let me shift away, right? But she continued to make her advances, and he got accused falsely, but nevertheless, remember Joseph's example. That was just a you know what I'm saying? Like, think about those situations, right? So my point is, it's you basically, you turn away from those situations, and you try not to step out of your element. I'm telling you, it's not always easy, because sometimes you might have certain thoughts that might want to get carnal, right? But that's one thing Esau definitely wants, and that's one thing Satan wants, right? So this is 1 Corinthians 2 verse 15 in the Amplified, and it says, but the spiritual man, the mature spiritual, I'm sorry, the spiritually mature Christian, which the first Christians were called the Israelites were first called Christians in Antioch, judges all things, questions, examines, and applies what the Holy Spirit reveals, yet is himself judged by no one. The unbeliever cannot judge or understand the believer's spiritual nature, right? So someone who's spiritual can't understand your judgments, because you're judging things spiritually, right? So you make certain judgments, so by refraining and allowing the Lord to basically fight for you, right? So eventually Saul, he ended up I think he passed on a battlefield or something like that. So eventually it wouldn't look like, okay, David put his hands on him. So there was definitely certain situations, what's it called, David, had opportunity to do something, and then he didn't do it, right? There was always some kind of intervention, right? So that's pretty much the point. It's all part of spiritual warfare, whether it's somebody you might live with, whether it's somebody people you deal with on the workplace, you know what I mean? Whether it's whether it's people you might meet in public, whatever, right? These things happen, right? It really and truly is a spiritual war, right? So so these are things to reflect on, And Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. So I have to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.